Today we're going to start with Jag Williams, who is going to give us a paper entitled Social Location and Warrant. Jag, please take it away.
All right, thank you. Let's move this over the side. All right, so today's paper, I'm going to be talking, the basic argumentative thread I'll be trying to identify is attention about whether or not to investigate conspiracy theories. Particularly, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the particular strand of thought, because I take myself to be a particularist. And but I do think there's still some friendly location for some revisions, I think, in the standard account of when or when not to investigate, and how it's that kind of responsibility to investigate is contextually situated. So I'm going to propose three problems that, at the very least, are three problems that I'm interested in, and gesture towards a solution in terms of a focus on what I would call the epistemology of social location, how one's social location delimits what one is required to investigate. And the conclusion hopefully being a sort of context-sensitive prima facie responsibility to investigate. So the key focus here being when is an agent responsible to investigate a conspiracy theory? So I'm not going to spend too much time on this side since it's been, I think the knowledge about these two camps is pretty well known. But basically, the generalism side, there's a class of theories. There's a class of things we call conspiracy theories. There's an epistemic quality or vice to them all that make them unwarranted to believe in all cases. The key intuition guiding this being there's epistemic and social harms related to this class of theories. So in order to avoid them, we should not legitimize them in any kind of way that would involve taking them as credible. So as this relates to investigation, you are not warranted to investigate them in any kind of way of treating them as credible. You may want to investigate them as a form of debunking, but you definitely don't want to investigate in any kind of way where it's you care about the truth of them. Second, the opposite camp is the more neutral definition of conspiracy theory, where you must evaluate not on the basis of a class, but on the basis of individual merits, where what turns out is some of these might actually be warranted. The key intuition that has been articulated in many helpful ways is there's a certain commonness to conspiracies, both in history and in present day, where it's worth keeping a certain sort of social and political vigilance. And you might even actually find out some philosophically interesting things about through a study of conspiracy theories. And how investigation typically, or one's responsibility to investigate typically gets parsed out in particularism, is you can't rule a conspiracy out on the basis of class alone, on the basis of being a conspiracy theory. You have to evaluate it based on its merits. And the rest of the talk, I'm focusing mainly on particularism because everything I'm going to say about the particularists, I can say twofold or about the generalist side. Because basically, I want to say conspiracy theories, we can't treat them as a class of things that we should be reluctant to investigate. But that doesn't mean we can't have a sense of reluctance about certain kinds of conspiracy theories. And even a reluctance so strong so as to not even have to evaluate the merits of certain kinds. We can have a default reluctance, a default entitlement to not investigate. So that is going to already rule out generalism while also revising particularism. So my goal here is to have a nuanced account of reluctance for our particularist account. I want to be clear that I am not going the Patrick Stokes route. I'm not doing this on the basis of moral grounds to where we have moral reasons to not investigate. I think a few scholars have already pointed out the difficulties of this trajectory. I want to argue on, I want to put forward an epistemological argument, focusing on social location as an epistemic function that brings with it sensitivities and delimits responsibilities so as to not require investigating conspiracy theories of certain varieties. So that's the goal, is to have a nuanced form of reluctance. Now, I know all the particularists in the audience are already thinking to themselves, we already have that. So the particularists are going to there's already a feature of reluctance in their account. And this is spelled out in Basham's response to Stokes. So Basham is going to say that particularism doesn't mean we embrace the theory. just means we seek evidence for or against it, and that is simply the particularist position. And I want to acknowledge that. I think there is an account of reluctance of sort in the particularist field. It fills it through an evidentialist lens. And so Pignon talks about this in terms of the criterion of defectibility. Basham and Dentith also talk about this in terms of prior probabilities within a socio-historical context. So there is a route to, there is already a sense of reluctance in the particularist account. You're not taking every conspiracy theory as true. You're evaluating it on its merits. But even then, there's still, I think, a bit of there's a bit of at least some ambiguity about what that all means. So, for instance, you have Pignon says some conspiracy theories may be way too out, too way out to be worthy of investigation, and these are because they are absurd or improbable. So it's not the generalist account; it's just that these specific theories are absurd or improbable. So it seems in this way we don't have to investigate it because it's so absurd or improbable. Dentith talks about the same thing when they mention when they discuss the community of inquirers and how they could go about investigating conspiracy theories, and they say that they're only motivated to investigate it when there are compelling reasons to do so. So even then, there's that sense of reluctance to investigate all conspiracy theories that is present in the particularist camp. But then there's a sense of almost investigating to figure out whether or not you have to investigate a theory that I think where some ambiguity at least arises for me about how to cash this out as a particularist. So Pignon talks about developing a set of criteria which will help distinguish between good and bad conspiracy theories, between those that are sensible to believe or investigate. And so and then likewise, Dentith talks about how the context is going to determine whether or not we should take certain data as being fortunate or fortuitous, which features into their argument for how we treat evidence in conspiracy theories. The main thing I want to draw out here is there's three problems I think this evidentialist way of cashing out reluctance falls into. The first one is what I would call the economic problem, which I've heard Dentith talk about at a previous conference before, which is how I cash it out at least is there's going to be a certain ambiguity about conspiracy theories and compelling reasons, and figuring out how to cash out that ambiguity or figuring out how to cash out whether or not to investigate some conspiracy theories or what to treat as compelling reasons is actually going to be pretty difficult. So there's a quantitative finitude that we might be concerned about, not enough hours in the day issue. Qualitative, not enough expertise to properly investigate it. At least I know that's at least certainly true for myself. And a perspectival finitude, not enough access to different perspectives to investigate the topic fully. So those are some potential economic problems that one might run into when trying to figure out whether or not they should investigate a theory. Are they even equipped? Can they rely on something else in order to figure out whether or not to investigate a theory that's other than evidences, because they don't have access to the proper kind of evidences? Dentith does propose a good response, I think, though, to this kind of problem in the form of a community of inquirers. So they would be able to divide the cognitive labor between each other, expertise and perspectives. You get a wide variety of kinds of people figuring out whether their theory is good or not. But this doesn't really solve the problem I'm interested in terms of the issue of when we're responsible to investigate. And that's primarily because I think the community inquirers model works at a more global level, or more a less local level at the very least. It doesn't articulate the kind of responsibilities that individuals or communities or cultures would have in their experience of conspiracy theories. So, anecdotal note, I have a friend who brings to my table all kinds of conspiracy theories, and it's hard for me to figure out, and I'm aware of the literature, and it's hard for me to figure out which ones are worthy of investigation, which it's not. And there's a part of me that wants to be able to be confident, to not be epistemically irresponsible to say I'm not going to investigate these. And there needs to be some kind of discussion of how that would play itself out at the individual level as well as the more local community level. And so I think even with the community of inquirers model, doesn't quite solve the problem of responsibilities to investigate. There's also the ethical problem that Stokes brings up. There's certain conspiracy theories or conspiracy theory as a social practice that might be morally problematic for all kinds of reasons, whether it's stereotyping, whether it's unjust promotion of distrust, which I think we should be concerned about a bit. But there's also, I think, great responses that this kind of concern isn't perfectly articulated in Stokes's argument. So one, we could deny Stokes's kind of brute force claim that ethics is superior to epistemology in these issues by just saying the reverse. Two, Basham and Pignon identify how eliminating social vigilance might also restrict the positive moral status of investigating conspiracy theories. So that is something to consider. And dentists also contest that one of Stokes's claims is if we promote the kind of investigative conspiracy theories, you have people who are accused of unjust things, maybe wrongfully, and that in the public sphere, and that would be harmful to them. But Dentith talks about all kinds of ways that we have certain social roles responsible for those kinds of private investigations that are only made public after a certain duration. So Stokes's argument, at the very least, as it's currently articulated, doesn't quite hit. But I think we can reframe it in a way that it would still be a potential problem for the evidentialist account of reluctance for the particularist, which is the evidential account doesn't fully acknowledge the way ethics in our moral evaluation of fellow agents or our moral evaluation of the world plays a role in our initial acts of discovery and investigation. And I think if we were to re-articulate Stokes in a different way, we could bolster his account to focus more on this kind of initial side of things, where we want ethics to, in some relevant way, influence the kinds of epistemic agents we are. So, and I'm not sure the standard evidentialist account of reluctance tackles this issue of moral influence and potentially just like community belonging that restricts our investigation of conspiracies at the not at the end, at the conclusion of investigation, but even at the initial stages of, is it morally appropriate for me to investigate this? What kind of moral agent do I have to be to want to investigate this? I think those are questions that are relevant to the discussion of when or when not to investigate conspiracy theories. And finally, here's the problem I think I'm most interested also. So the evidentialist route of delimiting the investigation space assumes a certain access to probabilities of evidence that can, even if pursued, relevantly determine the appropriateness of a conspiracy theory. But I don't think it's that simple. I think a lot of times conspiracy theories are hinge upon certain kinds of trust values or belonging patterns where you're going to the kind of common ground that would make a conspiracy theory fully intelligible is built on features of trust that I would say aren't clearly evidentialist in articulation and blend more towards the non-evidential patterns, as in they aren't clearly an evidence toward a conclusion. They kind of feature as more of a ground for which evidence is built off of. So one of the concerns I have is, even if we do the evidentialist route, can it really resolve whether or not to investigate these theories at the initial level, or is there some kind of non-evidential means of trust that is required to even get investigation and whether or not to investigate off the ground? And so some, of course, potential responses, since the whole issue of testimony and trust is a difficult question in general, evidentialists might want to try to parse this out in terms of what I want to call non-evidentialist means. They might want to parse it out in evidentialist articulations. But I think at the end of the day, there's going to be a problem. There's kind of the issue of you can't have turtles on turtles. The evidence account must have stopped somewhere, and I think that irresolvability, that kind of stopping somewhere, ultimately must ground itself in some non-evidential feature. And I want to call that feature social location, and how social location builds into sensitivities that we can relevantly rely upon without proving in order to say what we should investigate, what we should not investigate. So to kind of summarize that kind of quick movement, because I know I went through a variety of ideas there in a quick manner, I'm trying to say, and I'm trying to answer the question, are there certain theories that need not be investigated prior to even evaluating evidential merit? I want to say yes. Even as a particularist, I want to say yes. And it's not because I want to say that we should be reluctant because they're epistemically vicious, or we should be reluctant because they're morally vicious. I want to say yes because our social location habituates in us sensitivities that in appropriate ways limit limit the kind of things we ought to investigate without some kind of strong evidence to disprove. So in this way, I also want to be very careful though, because I think Basham identifies some things, some considerations that anybody who wants to develop a reluctant account of particularism needs to take seriously. So to summarize those two things, one, we need to have the kind of reluctance that leaves space for epistemic revisions. So if something changes in one's location so as to require a more attentiveness to possibilities of conspiracy that were in that context not appropriate, then the reluctance needs to be modified, and a theory needs to accommodate that. And two, political and suspicion and social vigilance need to be on the table in the relevant ways. So reluctance cannot be overly general, cannot be overly universal. It must be able to account for the sensitivities of a social location. And it's, as one scholar calls it, even the polyphonic nature of social locations, how there's more than one discursive community within a geographic space. So I like to cash this out in terms, I want to try to answer these goals, answer the economic, ethical, and irresolvability problem in terms of an epistemology of social location. So one scholar who I rely on is the work of Quill Kukla. They've worked in areas of empirical knowledge, discursive knowledge, and even more recently, a philosophy of urban geography, where the main thrust of their work is to talk about how, just like Aristotle indicates, there's a moral training that our moral values, our moral attitudes are trained in us through habits and activities. Kukla wants to argue that there's a corollary to that in our epistemic sensitivities. Through the kinds of habits, through the kinds of spaces we occupy, we come to be trained to see the world in particular ways. And these are sensitive to the kinds of habits and activities we're engaged in. This can be further parsed out in terms of what Pollas Jr. has called situatedness and interdependency. So situatedness is, and how she uses it in this specific context, is talk about how one's social identity leads to certain avenues, but also obstacles that one must cope with. So she works primarily in issues of feminism and philosophy of race. So she's going to talk about how one's marginal identity is going to lead to avenues and obstacles that, in virtue of being the kind of person they are in a certain space, they must learn to cope with. They're going to develop proficiencies, a certain mastery. Interdependency names the kind of higher level knowledge that emerges from one's situatedness. So as people of relevantly similar identities come to operate in the same space, they develop conceptual resources for understanding their own experiences and the nature of the environment around them. To give a basic example of this, if you think of even a park ranger, they're going to have a certain kind of sensitivity to the natural world that I certainly don't have, in virtue of their inculcation in that space. And park rangers might develop certain vocabulary for understanding their role as a park ranger within those spaces. And even if you get more particular, maybe a park ranger in Alaska is going to be different than a park ranger in Utah. So there's a kind of mastery that comes with it, the kind of spaces they occupy, a sensitivity to those spaces that is specialized, and they develop resources for. I want to apply this to conspiracy theories. How one comes to understand the warrant or the likelihood of a conspiracy theory is going to be in many ways based off of the kinds of habits and practices they must develop and master in order to be a proficient epistemic agent in a context. And there's going to be even the discursive communities that are going to have to master certain varieties of conspiracies over others. In the American context, the most clear case of this is things like the Black community and state and federal law enforcement. So one of my examples I read about that I really appreciated was Martin and Hustings and Orr's work on the issue in LA with the drug activity in LA, and how the Black community was saying for a while that it was the CIA's involvement and it wasn't really taken seriously but no one else really saw it because they didn't have the kind of sensitivities to that environment that they were being, the Black community was one being accused, not other white community, not other neighborhoods. I also think that we can incorporate through a focus on social location how requirements or responsibilities to know certain things are in fact delimited by one's location. So Jose Medina talks about this in a variety of ways, and I'll give a quick example of this after I introduce these concepts. But basically, due to the kind of epistemic sensitivities you ought to know in order to be a master within that kind of context, there's also going to lead to certain requirements of what you need to know in order to be a master, or at least to be a responsible agent in that context. So example Medina uses is from his time when he was a professor at Vanderbilt, when a fraternity house decided it would be a good idea to go to a Jewish organization on a Jewish holiday, and I believe they either put pig flesh or they put some kind of pig parts around the organization building, and they were ultimately caught. And one of the things they claimed was they didn't really understand the full significance of their actions. And Medina, while being suspicious of that kind of defense in the first place, also argued that even if they were not fully aware of the significance of their actions, they ought to have been aware, because you're in a university setting where you know there's a diversity of identities, and we have a certain democratic notion running in the background of these kind of social structures, that you should, at the very least, you should be cautious in what you're going to act on, and you should most likely make the moves to know certain things that you need to know. You need to make moves to know the kinds of social, the other people in your context, as well as the social structures that guide the kind of appropriate behaviors that in your context. So Medina puts forward an argument for our context determining what's appropriate to know on a minimal level. This, I think, is also applicable to conspiracy theories, because what one ought to know about what to be suspicious of and what not to be suspicious of is going to be socially located as well. I could think of a plethora of examples, but one example is I'm currently residing in Florida, and I am highly suspicious of my governor. I have all kinds of reasons to be so, and so I have a default suspicion towards the policies he enacts and such. What I think this can lead into is a kind of answer to the problem of investigation, which I want to call a kind of externalism in motion. So the externalism part is the social location determines the default status of what we ought to take seriously. It delimits a space of investigation. And it doesn't delimit in the sense of conspiracy theories are wrong and you shouldn't investigate them unless really, really challenged. It gets more fine-grained. Conspiracy theories might not be relevant in a specific context. So maybe you have a default trust in your local community government officials, but you have a default suspicion towards your state level officials. It allows for a default trust in some conspiracies. I'm sorry, default suspicion towards some conspiracy and towards some conspiratorial explanations, while also limiting the space of what you need to investigate or take seriously. And what's cool about this also, I think, is because the social location can alter or be changed, this default nature can be challenged so as to be altered, and the investigation space is either expand or can maybe even be refined to become smaller, but it's not a concrete for all time default treatment of conspiracies. Second, it allows for a different scope of knowledge, different scope of analysis at different levels of conspiratorial explanation, whether it's individual, local, global. It allows you to take seriously a particular context and the kind of investigation space that you required. So you can go the community of inquirers route, and also get into a more focused particular route at the smaller scales. And what this allows for is a certain kind of relationality of understanding war inappropriateness that I think critiques the generalism account for sure, but also refines the particularist mode of treating reluctance, because you can avoid the economic problem. It constrains the relevance of investigation, so it allows you to know what's appropriate at the individual, community, and more global scales. Two, and it automatically incorporates some kind of ethics of knowing, as we saw in the Medina account. There's a ethics of what one ought to know in terms of the other people in their community and the social structures, that how they should be treated. So there's a moral element to this as well. And there's also it matches to the irresolvability problem, because that externalist model at the core allows some kind of responsibility to investigate in certain cases, but also a reluctance to investigate in others on the basis of the context of social location. So the goal of this account is to try to nuance the reluctance and particularism, not to refute particularism, but to give space for knowing you don't have to investigate something without giving evidences for why you don't have to investigate it. Knowledge without access to justification, I think, is something that I think is worthwhile. So because I'm running short on time, probably won't spend as much time on this last two sections I have, but I think that there's key implications of this kind of context sensitivity. One, it allows us to take seriously marginal identities in relationship to conspiracy theories. I think there's often a kind of elitism about conspiracy theories, where there's an assumed general perspective that one ought to have, and you should trust certain things, you should trust over other things. And I think that it's actually much more complicated than that. Gender, race, sexuality, these kinds of identity markers can feature prominently in how one relates to the warrant of whether or not a conspiracy is worthwhile or not. So this relates to Black Americans and distrust towards COVID-19 vaccine, which I read an article recently is actually decreasing. So that's something to make aware of. It's still the trust rates are still lower than other identities, but it's all around decreasing the hesitancy. But also there's a really interesting paper by Grudzika where she talks about Irish women and distrust towards HPV vaccine and how that relates to COVID-19 vaccine, and how women have been treated in Ireland, and how that could potentially affect their overall trust in medical institutions, even ones that are typically seen we ought to trust, such as relating to vaccines. So I think this account allows a certain kind of empathy and humility that I see often missing, often lacking in debates about Warrant. Finally, I want to avoid the potential objection that this is just generalism disguised. So it's a common complaint against Stokes, is that it is just generalism disguised. I believe mine gets a little bit more nuanced than Stokes' argument. So there is default knowledge we can have about what to investigate, what not to investigate, but it's also defeasible default, a kind of externalist model that can be altered. And I think that openness to alteration, that malleability to one's default structure allows for the kind of continued vigilance, continued social and political vigilance that we would want from a particularist account. And also while taking seriously the evidences that can arise that would at some point maybe challenge that default structure. So I officially hit 30 minutes, so I'm gonna stop there. I look forward to the Q&As and you guys refining these ideas.
Thank you, Jag, for a very, very interesting discussion about exactly what we might do to refine the notion of particularism. We already have a comment / clarification from Charles. So here's a distinction which perhaps I failed to make. My thesis is not so much that one ought to investigate every non-silly conspiracy theory. Rather, my thesis is that the fact that something is a conspiracy does not mean we ought not to investigate it. So which one should one investigate or be interested in the investigations of? Provisional answer, the ones that you need to know about to be a responsible citizen. So, for example, I, as a British NZ citizen, don't need to have an opinion about the various conspiracies surrounding the murder of JFK.
Yeah, and I always thought while reading Charles's papers that we were in hefty agreement. So I think that is probably a fault of my own reading rather than a fault of yours, Charles, because I always got the sense that we were in quite alignment. And so I'm happy to hear if you think so too.
We also have a question from Melina. A recent study showed that there are higher levels of conspiracy beliefs in more corrupt countries. But would that not be true? Would there not be both true and false conspiracy theories floating around in such locations also? Would you say that in such locations are best managed through non-evidence accounts?
What I would say is, so the location here, social location is a general term that can be specified a little bit more, because even within those kind of more corrupt countries, I don't necessarily mean there's one social location governing that whole geographic space. I gestured at it, but I didn't really get to talk about it too much. But within even a localized space, such as like a specific district within a specific region within a country, there's going to be a plethora of communities and how they understand things. How I would go about saying that there's that tension between communities who are going to say certain conspiracy theories are true and other ones are false. I begin with the assumption that no one is going to have a completely perspectival knowledge of whether a conspiracy theory is true or false. So I begin the discussion with an assumption that these two communities need. It's best to just begin with the assumption that there's a disagreement, and that appealing to some grander access or grander authority is not going to be helpful. So what I would say, how to go about managing true or false, I think the non-evidential route is going to be important, because trust and figuring out how to get one's trust might be gained by evidential routes, such as like, oh, you should believe this person for this reason, or this person for that reason, that's institution for this reason. That might be the case, but at least in lots of public health strategies that I've read about, lots of the ways that people are minds are altered is this person who I am already related to, or is this person who I'm in conversation with, do I get a sense that I can believe them? Do I get a sense my attitude needs to change on the basis of just knowing them? So one of the things that's been interesting to read is how this relates to even a different issue, that such as the approval of homosexuality in America. There is a clear correlation between parents who end up having kids who are in the LGBTQ plus community and their later acceptance of those kinds of identities. So this might be, and I'm not sure that that's best parsed out in terms of an evidential account as much as you come to have a sense of belonging with someone else you weren't with a way of living that you weren't yet accustomed to. So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying I do think maybe there's certain locations where the evidential route might be applicable, but to assume the evidential route's the best might not be. Non-evidential means might be more appropriate because you need to manufacture trust at some point for evidential arguments to get off the ground.
So I'm quite curious about one particular issue here. So when you talked about the minimal knowledge set that a person can need to engage in an investigation, there's a question there as to exactly how precisely we can work out what that minimal knowledge set is. So take, for example, the example you used of homosexuality in America. One person might go, well, actually, the minimal knowledge set I need is evolutionary biology. I need to know what is the function of homosexuality for the continuation of the species. And according to my minimal knowledge set, homosexuality does not seem to work to make the species work out better because you get fewer offspring and thus, fewer human beings. And another person will go, well, no, actually, the minimal knowledge set you need is not just biology. You also need all the social relations that go on here, and the idea that actually sexuality is a construct. It's not consistent across species, except blah 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 blah. So how do we work out what that minimal knowledge set is that then allows us to license that kind of reluctance and rule out some things as not being relevant?
That's a good question, and that's where you would, I think, at least the hope would be, if you're given a specific context, you're going to have some overlapping default structures. So like you said, you mentioned the possibility of like someone appealing to social rules regarding like homosexuality and all those things. The social structure I would appeal to, that if you're going to be a participant in American society, is going to be some kind of democratic, at least even ideal, that one could use in an evidential way to kind of promote something of agreement about how all people deserve human rights and dignity in the nation. So I think in that specific example, there might be a common ground that's already there that just has to be articulated and evidentially put forward and convince that person of. So in that example, I think, again, that evidential route might be actually on the table, springing from a non-evidential grounding, that is, we're born into a society that's hopefully run by ideals of liberty and life and as the Constitution, pursuit of happiness kind of thing. So that'd be my response, which I would at least try out and see if that works.
Fair enough. We have a final question from Charles. Are you perhaps running together two distinct things? Relativism about warrant or credibility, and relativism about salience. I'm all for the second, but not so sure about the first. This does not mean that different people might be more epistemically privileged than others with respect to some questions, but privilege consists in being an objectively better position than someone else to get it right.
Let me read that question back to myself too. About warrant. This does not mean that different people might be more epistemically privileged than others. I'm not sure if I fully understand the second paragraph, but I think I can say something about the first question about whether or not I'm running together salience and warrant. In many ways, I am running them together a bit, but not in ways I think are inappropriate. So warrant involves perspective, but that doesn't mean there's no such thing as objectivity that we can, at least as a regulative ideal, strive towards. So just because I have perspective doesn't mean that my knowledge is perspective doesn't rule out objectivity. So it's not a relativism of any kind of vicious kind. I can still make claims on the basis of I can still have someone can have more knowledge than someone else through the kind of inculcated through the kind of inculcated training they have, through the kind of sensitivities of engaging with the world. So I don't think it's a vicious relativism. But I'm not sure how to answer the second one. This could be because it's late at night for me, but I don't quite understand it. If you would like to type it in the chat or another question again, I might be able to give a better response.